As soon as you start doing better than they are, they change the rules of the game.
We're very excited to share this brand new episode of the Project UMOJA podcast.
You have to develop your own game and say, okay, come and play with us.
UZODINMA IWEALA is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and medical doctor.
The continent itself is a place where if we do it right, there's a huge amount of opportunity.
How do we go about empowering more Africans and people of African descent to share their stories?
It's not just about pushing narratives into this space, it's about saying, how do we reconstruct this space entirely?
A lot of it also comes down to leadership.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't double down in making sure that we construct the game that we want to play.
How do you actually form leaders? You can't have everyone go out.
It's all about exchanging ideas. It's all about going out and saying, okay, we can send that African kid out and like have that person get the knowledge and come back.
Africa pour les Africains.
Je ne vois pas pourquoi nous ne chercherions pas ce qui nous unit au lieu de chercher ce qui nous divise.
La lutte continua.
What is needed? Togetherness. Unity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Project UMOJA podcast, the Pan-Africanist podcast dedicated to uniting and empowering the global African community. As always, we are your co-hosts, Fontali, Maurice Gwakumakisa, and Abdelaziz Diko, who unfortunately cannot join us today, but is here with us in spirit.
Hello, Uzo. Welcome, Akwaba Karibu.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
We're delighted to have you here today. How many of you know someone who is both an acclaimed author and a medical doctor and a CEO? Today, our guest is all of those and more. A graduate of Harvard University and the Columbia University of College of Physicians and Surgeons. UZODINMA is also CEO and editor-in-chief, co-founder of Ventures Africa magazine, a publication that covers the evolving business, policy, culture, and innovation spaces in Africa. His books include Beast of No Nation, a novel released in 2005 to critical acclaim and transformed into an award-winning film starring the one and only Idris Elba that you can watch on Netflix.
Great movie, guys.
Absolutely, and his short stories and essays have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, the Paris Review, among others. And if that wasn't enough, in his current role, he is the CEO of the Africa Center based in New York City, which is dedicated to promoting a new narrative about Africa and its diaspora. He is the son of Ikemba Iweala, a family physician, and of course, the legendary Ngozi okonjo-iweala, the first African and the first woman to lead the World Trade Organization.
Wow. Uzo, I mean, you're the perfect African child. That's what you are, you know. And you clearly have some big shoes to fill as well. But you know, these, you know, in prepping for these interviews, we've seen a lot of your interviews. We've looked at your work. I've watched Beast of No Nations for anyone that hasn't already seen that on Netflix. But tell us something about you that like doesn't typically come out, but that you would say kind of like defines your path and speaks to who you are as an artist, as a doctor, as a leader.
That is a question to open with. First of all, thank you guys for having me. One point of correction, I should say my dad's actually a neurosurgeon and a family physician. So just to correct all that, I would be remiss if I did not. And in terms of something to tell you about myself that helps to define who I am, I don't know, I'm going to go with the very easy, cheesy. I have a cat. And I tell you about this cat because it might seem strange, but I do have a cat. I know sometimes as Africans, we don't really like cats, but I love cats. I didn't used to love cats. My cat is named Beckett, and my cat was actually found on the streets of Lagos. Now 6 years ago, and it's a story. I had somebody visiting me who saw the cat in the gutter and was like, "Oh, what a cute cat!" And I was like, "What are you doing? Leave that animal alone. Don't touch that animal." And she picked up the cat and brought it back to my apartment, and then left me with this cat. And this cat is now like it's my cat. I then brought the cat to the United States, which was kind of an interesting thing. I brought it in through customs and remember being so afraid. I mean, I did all the paperwork, but I was really afraid because you don't have this cat from the streets of Nigeria.
Right,
so I immediately went up to the customs person when I landed at JFK, and I was like, I just want to let you know I have a cat. And the guy looks at me and goes, I don't give a shit. And then that was that. You know, and I say that all just to say, I mean, that's, you know, it's funny, but it does for me in many ways encapsulate a lot of the time that I spent in Lagos. I was living there for 6 years before I moved back to the United States to do the Africa Center job. And, you know, it's all about sort of like the strange ways that Nigeria works and impacts and shifts who you are as a person, right? I never thought I would be a cat person. And now suddenly if you touch my cat, I'll kill you. But it's, you know, just, it gets at it for me, how that experience of being home, whatever you decide is home in the country that you're from or the countries that you're from, is a really transformative kind of thing. So maybe that helps.
So you grew up here and then you were in Nigeria for like a 6-month period. Like a lot of people either dream of. Okay, go ahead. So
I grew up. I was born and grew up in Washington D.C. We grew up going back every other summer, basically. So most of my family actually was in Nigeria. And then after I graduated college, which is a long time ago now, damn, it's crazy to say that, I moved back right after finishing university. And then after finishing medical school, I moved back, and I was living there for 6 years. So I moved back in 2012 after I finished med school. And then that, you know, to do all kinds of, I don't know what I mean, I do know I went back. I didn't have anything specific in mind, but I knew I wanted to be back, and I wanted to be back as an adult human, as opposed to somebody who's in tow with your parents, or, you know, it's also different when you go back after you finish college, right? You're still, you know, as we know, on our continent, you're youth until you're well into your 60s, right? So you go back as a 22-year-old or something like that, you're still kind of like in your parents' house. And there was this desire to go back and operate, set up as me, and then explore my understanding and relationship to Nigeria as me, separate, or in some senses, and you'll never be independent of your parents, but in some ways independent of that influence. So, you know, starting my own business, setting up my own apartment, like, you know, all these things are experiences that I think I needed to be a bit older to like really inhabit and do. And they were definitely experiences. I mean, they definitely reshaped the way that I think about Nigeria and also about myself. So.
Wow, it's so interesting. I mean, because a lot of people, I definitely do agree with that. Even in my experience, being home is very much you're in your parents' house. This is your parents' roof, basically, yeah. Right? So right. Like that need to go back and really establish yourself, I definitely do. It resonates a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big thing. And I think, you know, you can't underestimate the pull of that, because it's not, I think so often we think about our sort of relationships to, you know, again, the continent, whether you're talking about Cameroon or you're talking about Nigeria, you're talking about, I don't know, one of those other places that maybe exist on the continent. I'm just kidding. Like whether you talk about, you know, we tend to talk about them in almost static terms, like they don't change. And like, we don't change, right? And the truth is, it's a dynamic relationship, right? So who you are as a 7-year-old going back to visit your grandparents, you know, like in the village, you know, like in my case, right, and spend time with them, is different from who I was as a, you know, 28-year-old going back to now go visit my grandparents in the village, but going back without my parents, making that journey by myself, understanding like the intensity, the vagaries, like the idiosyncrasies of just movement and travel through Nigeria, becoming familiar with that and becoming comfortable with that, or being comfortable with my discomfort in that. Because I don't know if you've ever been to Nigeria at Christmas time, for example. If you feel comfortable in that, you are an insane person. I will just put that out there. So, you know, but like you get to understand like, okay, so this is how things operate. But, you know, Nigeria changes in the same way. And I often think about it like this. My parents left or moved from Nigeria, like my dad, you know, after finishing med school and all that sort of stuff. My mom actually came to the United States for college. And it's funny, my dad and I would get into arguments, like, again, when I moved back as an adult, where he'd be like, he'd come back, you know, he'd come to Lagos. Like, also, you realize that Nigeria or whatever country you're in is super big, and your parents have a particular experience. Like, my dad never really lived in Lagos, right? Like, he lived in the East, he lived in Ibadan, but like, he never lived in Lagos. Neither did my mom really live in Lagos. So Lagos is kind of like not their city, but I would say it's my city. I moved there as an adult and sort of started trying to establish myself there. So I'm living in Lagos. My parents have a house there. They come to stay. And then they're trying to tell me, oh, you shouldn't go out. You shouldn't do this. And I'm like, old people, why? Why are you saying these things? Like, you don't know this city in the way that I know this city. And that dynamic is a hard one, because it's true they don't, but they have an understanding of what Lagos is based off of what it was in their own, like, in sort of like the mythology of Lagos as a city, you know, when they were coming up, or, you know, from what their experience from their you know, like their brothers and sisters who do live there. But like, it's not the same experience that I have as like a 30-year-old, or I had at the time as like a 30-year-old man, or, you know, somebody who's started a business, who moves from place to place in this town. And, you know, that's the dynamic sort of transformational, constantly changing aspect of what it means to be in a place, from a place, and to relate to a place, that I think we don't often take into account as people who speak about it. And certainly as diaspora folks, I think we think of it as home country, like that there's just a certain staticness. And it's only now that I think people are really beginning to like appreciate and lean into the dynamism. Not that we don't know it exists, but like to really lean into it as a source of strength and a source of character, as opposed to, oh, it should be as this.
Right.
And maybe speaking of character and growth, as you know, this podcast will be distributed on the African Heroes magazine platforms. So we'd like to know who inspired you when you were growing up. Can you tell us who is your African hero if you had to pick one?
I mean, first of all, I'm just going to destroy your question, because you know I'm not going to pick one. Second,
oh, geez.
I think that it depends. And again, you know, like you're probably interviewing the wrong person, because I just don't give answers like that. I think there are different aspects of different people who are heroic to you based on like where you are or what you're doing and like the point you are in your life, right? So, you know, if I'm talking about being younger, you know, I can talk about and really wanting to write. Like the writer in me is enamored of Chinua Achebe, right? Like, you know, obviously he is in many ways the father of a whole branch of African lit that speaks to how we perceive ourselves and how we also project who we are to the wider world, right? There's no one who is, and you know, I am very lucky because I had the chance to meet Achebe, because he and my grandparents knew each other. I only met him once, but I remember him being such a wonderful and inviting, warm, welcoming, and generous man in terms of his just, you know, being who he is, right? And then you can see it in his work. I mean, I've met other very established African writers who I will not name, who maybe were not so generous in their relationship to those of us who are the youth. No, I ain't gonna say it. You know, so there's that. And like, you know, again, I was telling you that I teach at NYU, I teach creative writing. And it often just comes back to me thinking about this man's contribution, you know, this ability to shape the way that we think of ourselves as storytellers. And he's not the only one, right? He's one of many. But I think that the impact of his work and his presence is so outsized that, yeah, as a hero, I think within that space, he's very important. You know, but I would also be foolish if I didn't tell you about my grandfathers, both of them, for very different reasons in terms of the way that they have operated in this world, right? So on one side, my mom's father, an academic, you know, did his PhD in mathematics and economics, like in Germany back in the day. I should also say that my grandmother as well did her graduate studies in Germany. But think about this. Wow. These are Nigerians who leave Nigeria in the 1950s to go to Germany, a place where they don't speak the language. And then not just go there, but go there to do a PhD in math. that's insane. That's not normal, right? So I think about, like that. My grandmother on my mom's side is a sociologist, right? So, I think about, and it's funny to like go back as like a writer and somebody who, in some ways is like salty about the fact that he doesn't have a PhD yet, and think about like the work that she's done, and like really looking up papers from your grandmother about sociological developments, and like the development of the mentality or the society around African women, Eastern Nigeria, et cetera, and looking at these papers from the 1970s and being like, damn, your grandma was on some next level stuff, like while she was doing that. So there's that. And then on my dad's side, like my grandfather was a Methodist minister and a teacher. So, again, back in the day, like training up people to like bring education to folks. But then at the same time, like I think about this a lot, he eventually got his doctorate. He didn't get his doctorate until well into his 60s, but he was like, I'm going to get that. Like, this is something that I want to do, so I'm going to do it. And think about the perseverance. Think about somebody who was born, doesn't even, like sometime in the 20s. Both of my grandfathers are now passed, didn't even know when he was born. And then, like doesn't know the date of the year because they weren't keeping records like that. I'm sure y'all grandparents, like there's a similar situation. So when he died, he was anywhere from, like 92 to 96, give or take. Do you know what I'm saying? And then, somebody who's lived through that colonial period, who's lived through the transition of the society he grew up in into one where like Christianity takes hold, who then thinks about like, how do you train up this next generation of like teachers and leaders and students and whatnot? And then how do I express as a person my understanding of my faith? He wrote a couple of books on Igbo proverbs. Like how do I express my understanding of who we are as people? Like that's I think a heroic act, and it's not one that is going to be shouted to the history books because he wasn't super well known, or not as well known as say my mom's father, but he's somebody who still made his mark, right? And who said, I have to like, there's something about who we are as a people that I want to capture and put down, and I'm going to do that. So, and then we talk about my grandmother on my dad's side, who's also passed, but, imagine she completed primary school, didn't go further in education, had 10 kids, 3 of whom died, raised 7 of them, right? Lost 3 kids during the Nigerian Civil War, and, still found the strength, the energy, the will to go on after living through that horror show of a period of time in her life. I mean, just, I was thinking about this the other day. Just imagine what it means to like lose 3 children, right? Like that's a thing, and I don't think we think about just how intense the lives of our grandparents, or, even our parents, our elders are, right? Like given what they had to experience coming up into this world that was rapidly shifting around them. I mean, when you talk about heroes, like, yeah, I mean, I can say Nelson Mandela and all that. And sure, like, I love Nelson Mandela. And, I think one of the, like, most interesting things was getting to, like, meet Nelson Mandela. That was pretty crazy. But, like, Nelson Mandela is not, in many ways, like, is not a real figure to me because, he has been deified. Like what's real is these people that I think, I had a real interaction with. And that's not to, I mean, Nelson Mandela is Nelson Mandela. He will forever be Mandela, right? Like, right. And some of these, like these folks like Winnie Mandela, Graça Machel, like, all those folks will forever be who they are because they are so influential and majestic, right? But I think also we can't discount the everyday heroes that you are closer to, who may have had an outsized impact on people's lives and who also may not have, but have a real importance in terms of creating and constructing you as you in the world today. And then, obviously I have 2 parents, my mom and my dad, and they've done things too.
So.
Okay, wow. So I know you said you were going to destroy my question, but yeah. I mean, you just complexified it and just made it so much more meaningful. So thank you for that. Just, it's so interesting to see how like to kind of like move away also for beyond like the glorification, just like looking inwards, like looking at home and looking at what the people that are so close to you and how they have like shaped, your beliefs. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I'll say, mm-hmm. Oh no, I'll say one more thing. Like I like remember a lot. So for example, my dad's father, that's my grandfather on my dad's side, very like chill dude, simple, like very quiet man, like wouldn't really like, he's just like would like to sit and watch people and like wouldn't say very much, but like so wise. I remember there was one thing he would always say, and also so kind. He's the kind of person, he owned a store like in the village that my family is from. I don't think it ever really made any money because he was constantly like, somebody would come to buy something, they wouldn't have money, it's the village, and he would just say, okay, take it, come and pay me later, that kind of thing, right? So it's just, you understand the importance of like generosity, right? And then his thing he would always say is, Uzo, to much whom is given, much is expected, right? That biblical quote or whatever. And I think that's something that has stuck with me constantly. On the other hand, my mom's grandfather, think about this man who would always say things like, if you're going to lend somebody money, don't lend them, just give it to them, right? Don't expect somebody to give you something back in return. Again, that same generosity of spirit, just expressed differently. And then this like intensity of like, if you are going to do something, you best do it to the best of your ability, right? Like, don't ever get on the field and not act like you're gonna, and just kind of half-ass it. Like, he would never use those words, but do you know what I mean? It's that again, and you see it in the way that folks like live their lives, people who are doers extraordinaire. And when I say doers, I mean people who like live the doctrine that they preach, as opposed to, I think what we have a lot, which is people who say a whole bunch of shit, or like, post a whole bunch of stuff on Instagram, and then life is actually very different. And so I think, when I think about like living a good life, it's about how does your internal existence and the way you conduct and sort of your private life match up with the way that you want to project yourself to the wider world, and how do you make sure that those disconnects and the dissonance there like is minimized. There'll always be some, but it's, you don't want to be out here talking about like one thing and then in secret you're busy, I don't know, like you're preaching like chastity and piety, and then like, at home you got all kinds of stuff going on that people don't know. If you want to do that, like do that, live your life, but like live your life and let people know like this is how I'm living my life. Like don't exactly like be true to yourself. And I think that's the quest, and that's what I think is heroic, because it's really hard. It's very, very hard.
Absolutely. I mean, I love how self-aware you are, and how much time you've taken to reflect on how all these different people in your life, whether they were very close to you or just like were part of your family lineage, have impacted you. One of the things that you said that stuck with me was about your experience with other African authors, right? And, there's this, and Proverbs, Igbo Proverbs as well. There's this timeless African proverb that goes, until the lion learns to write, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Right. So one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about was actually the power dynamics of storytelling as an author. Right. And my question to you is, how do we go about empowering more Africans and people of African descent to share their stories? And how do we go about establishing the conditions necessary for more African perspectives to be shared and heard? Because absolutely, we definitely need more of that. And when you mentioned Chinua Achebe, that entire genre has played a big role in kind of shaping our minds and how we understand that era. So what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, I both love that quote and hate that quote, because now at every single like conference or, like business, whatever, that quote is like put next to some picture of Mount Kilimanjaro or something like that. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, and so I think it's a super meaningful proverb that I think we have stripped of meaning because we just say it, right? And and I don't think we think very sort of like deeply about it, right? So how do let me break it down in a couple ways. The first is that I often think that we don't give ourselves enough credit, that the stories are there and that people are telling these stories, right? The question is, as people who live on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Let's just call ourselves diaspora people. We find ourselves in a frustrated situation where our stories are not even secondary, they're not even tertiary, they're like, 10th on the list, right? And the thing is, we understand the power and the importance of this media ecosystem and this storytelling world, and that frustrates us. I think when you think about what goes on the continent, people are telling stories to themselves. Like Africans, we're all, we're out here. You go to any one of our countries, right, and read the newspaper, people are yelling, shouting, screaming. Like, go look at the sort of like local production of stories, whether you're talking about in the media that we produce. You know, look, we can all talk about the fact that publishing industries across the continent are not awesome when it comes to commercial viability, but that doesn't mean that people aren't finding ways to put these stories out there or are not circulating these stories. You know, so I want to say that our problem isn't that we aren't like generating or telling or producing and pushing stories. Our problem is that when you now start thinking about how these stories influence global actions, that's where we get caught, right? And the issue becomes how successful are we going to be? And look, we all have to do this because, again, we all live in these, we don't just live in isolation, but really and truly, how successful are you going to be pushing your stories on somebody else's platform, as opposed to, you know, and I say this, like, you know, Western media platforms, et cetera, you know, we're in the US and Canada now, right now, versus having our own platforms that have the ability to push and compete and control space in sort of like the global battlefield. Does that make sense? And so, absolutely. You know, when I think about it, this was one of the things that drove me to like work on this Ventures Africa project with my uncle, right? Was you need to start thinking about how you develop local platforms. And there are a bunch of them that are there. It's just resource-wise, you're talking about, it's the same problem that we have. Like if you're talking about a continental publication versus, you know, say the New York Times, just the weight in terms of who has what resources and the ability to deploy those resources is very different. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't double down in making sure that we construct the game that we want to play, as opposed to, and so that's what I think narrative is about. It's like, are you constructing the game that you want to play and constructing those rules, as opposed to trying to like play by somebody else's rules when they've also tied one hand behind your back, right? Beaten you before the game. And then like every time like you even get close, even after having been beaten and like had a hand tied behind your back, as soon as you start doing better than they are, they change the rules of the game. Like you're never going to win that game, right? Like you have to develop your own game and say, okay, come and play with us. And part of our problem, I think, is that like I think, you know, as somebody who like, again, grew up writing in and publishing in the Western space, who grew up in the United States of America, who is like very much conditioned by this, like the way that this country operates, you know, the prize here is great, right? Like if you can make it work here, they're outsized gains, like depending on who you are, right? Right. But you have to like, I think I have to always try to make sure that I have that perspective, which is like, this is not the only game in town. And to believe that this is the only game in town means that you have bought into that narrative 100%, and you will forever be second place in that narrative because it'll just change the rules. That's something that I keep thinking about now and that I keep struggling with, even as we try to build the Africa Center as an institution to deal with like the sort of lack of diversity and the sort of the pushing and promotion of more nuanced, diverse, interesting and powerful African narratives. I also have to think it's not just about pushing narratives into this space. It's about saying, how do we reconstruct this space entirely? Because it has to be reconstructed. Otherwise our narratives won't fly. That's the project. And it's, you know, it's one that's like not, that's a long-term thing, right? Like you won't, like in our lifetimes, like you guys are doing awesome things with the podcast, like, but I think we also have to think about the amount of time it takes to construct narratives. Again, just, you know, you can tell I think about this all the time. This is like literally all I think about, is that we also forget that the mythology that the West has created for itself is years old, right? We're not talking about 60 years, which is the amount of these sort of like, if we're talking about state formation mythology, like a lot of our countries are 60 years or less, right? And it takes time for you to build that narrative of self as a nation, if we believe that the nation is the sort of like the entity that we should all be operating by. Like these other folks, like they've been at this in very bloody narrative construction fashion for years, right? Like, and they're just getting to a point where they're not killing each other anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's only been in the last 70, 80 years that they haven't decided to slaughter each other for fun, basically. Like, you know, so I think we have to recognize that like the formation of these narratives does take a while, and it's a very complicated process. And we shouldn't let other people come in and just tell us that, oh, you guys should have an understanding, when they themselves don't even have an understanding of who they are and how to project it. I mean, like, we're dealing with, for example, right now, you're looking at the EU, where they're saying, oh, we're the EU, and Poland is saying, hold up, wait a minute. Like, I don't know about all that. Do you know what I'm saying? The UK is saying, hold up, wait a minute. I don't really know about all that. And it's this messy, complicated process. Like, we should cut ourselves some slack, even as we also understand that this is a super urgent thing that we have to do.
I'd like to pick up on, you talked about building of the self, referring to like state formation. I'd like to take this building of the self, but throw it back to you as a storyteller, as a writer. Earlier you mentioned you've been writing for, you know, from very early on, and we've talked a bit about like the infrastructure challenge, the power dynamics of storytelling. But what about you as a storyteller? Can you tell us about your writing process? What elements do you believe, you know, are necessary to craft a good story? But also, I'd really like to know how your process has evolved over time, especially that you've been writing for a while.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the funny thing is, like, I don't know when I started writing, but I do know that from a really young age, I always just liked paper and pens. And it's something that has carried over unfortunately, into adulthood. Because it's not lucrative, I'll just tell you that. Like, if you like anything else, like those things before you really like paper and pens. I just really liked paper, and I really liked the visual, like, you know, of paper on, like, a pen on paper, right? Like, I remember when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, you know, and people make fun of me about it a lot, but like my handwriting, this is one of the reasons I say that, like, I could never have been a doctor, because my handwriting is very it's not scribble. Like, it has to be, I'll just show it to you because I have something. Like, I don't know, can you see that?
Yes, yeah, so you can kind of see like the...
Yeah, I'm not going to let you read what it is, but like so when I was, I think maybe like 10 years old or so, I got really frustrated because you notice, like, when people write on online paper, it slants in one direction or another. And that drives me insane. I'm probably a little bit OCD, but it really makes me annoyed. So I think I spent, I don't know, it must have been like a few months where I would take a sheet of blank paper, and I would take a sheet of lined paper, and I would put it on a glass table and then put a light underneath so that I could learn to write straight, just so that it would look pretty. And then eventually, you know, like, you take away the lined paper and you take away the light, and then you now have figured out how to write straight without like on lined paper. And, like, you know, that's just to get into like the fascination that I had with these things. And of course you have to do something on the paper, right? You can't just like write nonsense on the paper. So I, you know, was really interested just in all honesty, I was really interested in science fiction. As a big Star Trek fan, I really liked those kinds of stories. And I think mainly as I come back to it as an adult, and, you know, somebody who's like teaching literature and writing, I think a lot of it had to do with this idea of being able to construct a world and looking at folks who were building these worlds, you know, and then you move and you evolve into, I don't know if it's evolve. I mean, I don't want to like throw shade on the sci-fi people, but like you're exposed to like other forms of lit, right? So I'm exposed to like Achebe at a pretty young age because of like the family history. Like, I'm exposed to like other African writers who, again, to go back to talk about why Achebe is such a hero, in his putting together the African Writers series, he gave a platform to so many other African writers that we might not have heard of, right? And then you go through that whole canon, you know, and as a writer, it's just the evolutionary process is being exposed to all kinds of different stories and realizing just how many different stories are out there, and having your mind blown when you read something that's like so absolutely fascinating that you just didn't even think about or you didn't know about. That's one. Mm-hmm. And then two, the next step in terms of the evolution is like, well, it's kind of this weird, like, you know, like audacity or arrogance, which is like, I mean, this dude wrote this thing. Well, why can't I write a story, right? Like, what's so crazy about this guy's story or this woman's story that I can't write? I remember this was years ago. I met Nadine Gordimer, the South African Nobel Prize winner. It was at this event in Italy. And, you know, I walked up to this woman who was like, you know, well into her 80s at the time. And I was like, you know, I read this collection of short stories of yours, and like, you're the reason why, like, you're one of the reasons why I thought I could write, because I read this collection of short stories and it was just so simple. I was like, I can do that too. And I was like, oh, wait, hold up. I didn't mean it like that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't trying to say, you know, I mean, you're my hero and all that, you know, like, you know, but but it's a testament to the beauty and the importance and power of her writing, that like, it's so clear that some 12-year-old boy, like, you know, Nadine Gordimer is a white South African lady, you know, like writing during apartheid, and some of her work is amazing, some of it is a little more problematic, right, I think, but that her clarity of vision and approach is so it's so powerful that like a 12-year-old Nigerian boy growing up in Washington D.C. can pick it up and be like, oh my God, that's how you tell a story, I want to do that. You know what I'm saying? That's very powerful, and that's part and parcel of the sort of evolution. Like now, I mean, when it comes to actually writing, so, you know, this is all to say, like, in a long-winded fashion, like reading and that exposure is so important. In terms of the actual process, like I'm both an incredibly scattered writer and also one that gets super disciplined when it's time to producing the work. So I'm scattered in the sense that it takes me a really long time to like get something to gel and crystallize. And you know, I'm basically about 7 years in between each book, or 5 to 7 years in between each book. Some people just do it much, much faster. I tend to like, you know, do all these other things in the world, I guess. And because I'm a little bit, maybe I have some kind of ADHD or whatever, but like, I'm still thinking about like the work. I'm still trying to like bring this story into my head. Like, you know, I wrote the initial, short story that became Beasts of No Nation when I was 14. And it took 7 years for it to crystallize, or for me to get into a position where I was ready to bring that narrative into like a full novel form. The book I wrote about HIV, the nonfiction book, I think it's, again, 2005 is when we sold that book, and it took 7 years for it to like really develop into something that like I was ready to say, okay, this is the statement that I'm ready to make, or I want to make, the story that I feel like telling about HIV. That I know how to tell, or that I'm privileged enough to tell. And then, you know, my last book, Speak No Evil, you know, is 6 years. I finished Our Kind of People in 2012, and it took me another 6 years to get Speak No Evil out, which was published in 2018. So there's a whole bunch of like foolishness that happens, and then all of a sudden I get extremely disciplined about writing like and finishing the novel, which is like, don't talk to me, don't speak to me. I don't want to hear you. I don't care who you are. I'm trying to write this book, right? And it's like almost going into that sort of tunnel space. When I was finishing my last novel, we were on vacation as a family. And I remember my mom coming to me after I had finished like my edits, and she said something like, you know, I like you a lot better when you're not writing books, because apparently like I'm just not like a very engaging, or like, you know, like that sort of like, it's tough. Like you go into like a kind of a crazy state,
right?
You know, and so that's like, you know, in a long way, kind of the process. It's lots of creative sort of space, and then, you know, what I would like to think of like really intense discipline, because in real fact, like telling any story, completing any story, or putting a story together that I think resonates with people, and this is whether you're doing it as a novelist or any other kind of like story that you're trying to put out. The difference between somebody who is successful and who's not is really the discipline, and not necessarily the creativity.
Wow, I think a lot of young writers are probably gonna hear you say this and like either get back in shape or spend some more time exploring the world and trying to figure out their process, because there's obviously a lot of reading that you have to do, a lot of practicing. I like how you kind of live life between projects also. I think that's important for a lot of artists. But you mentioned that like Beasts of No Nation, you know, comes out around 2005. Our Kind of People on HIV/AIDS, released in 2012. Speak No Evil, released in 2018, about a queer first-generation Nigerian American teen. Tell us what message, if you can briefly tell us what message you're trying to share with the world with every single one of these books. I think that'll be super interesting for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, I mean, I think it really is just about complexity, right? That you're the core of being a human is that we're all complicated. And so when I think about some of and I'll just be very frank that, like, again, this goes back to maybe the first question, is having grown up here in the United States and seeing how people speak about us as Africans, I think you do get into this thing where you're also writing to correct the record in some way, which, you know, people will say, why are you doing that? I don't actually have any problem with it. I don't think that it's like, if somebody's messing up your story, go out and tell your story, is the way I see it. It's like, it's not, there's no shame in that game, right? At the same time, I don't think you want to become too obsessed with only speaking to, right? So I think it's a balance, but, like, you know, so this is all to say that there are elements of that in my work. I remember when I wrote Beasts of No Nation, for me, it was two things. One is reading. I wrote the initial story when I was 14, because I read in the Washington Post some story about child soldiers in Sierra Leone. And actually what happened was I was reading this and I was like, wow, like, you know, I'm reading about somebody who's my age in Sierra Leone, which, you know, is not like, you know, you might, if you're a total American kid, you'd be like, I've never heard of this country. And it's like, obviously I've heard of Sierra Leone. I know what Sierra Leone is. I'm just thinking, like, you know, it's more of like this, it's so relatable in a way, and yet so unrelatable. It's almost that uncanny, right? Like, I could actually be this person, and not like, I can't imagine this person's life, right? And the reason why, you know, I say, like, one could actually be this person is, like, you look like that person. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, this person isn't like some random, like, yeah, we have the same features. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like, how do I then think about myself, like, in that space? And not only do I look physically like this person who's from the same part of the continent as I'm from, essentially, like, you hear stories. So, like, you know, I grew up hearing stories of the Nigerian Civil War, and some of the stories that people are reporting in the Post with such kind of, like, callousness. Like, I've heard those stories, but, like, heard them in, like, a really humanized version from relatives who survived some of these conflicts or who lived through some of these conflicts. So it's not just like I'm trying to explore. It's really about, like, there's a deep emotional curiosity and a deep emotional need to try to understand what it means to, like, live in that space. That's where, like, that's kind of where that book came out of. And then there's layered on top of it this idea that you keep reading all this nonsense that people are publishing in the newspapers of record that you see that dehumanize, even if they're trying to call attention to a particular conflict, and wanting to say, okay, well, this is what it is to be human. This is what it means to be human in some sense, like, having lived in this space. And, like, this is what it means to be a complicated human, as we all are. And again, like, I am not a child soldier. I didn't grow up as a child soldier, but I don't think that necessarily means that you can't try to step into that space and inhabit that emotional understanding or that emotional world. And in some senses, that was the project of Beasts of No Nation. And like all books and like all first novels, like, it succeeds in some areas and it fails in some areas, right? But, like, the point is, like, you try and then you take the criticism and, like, you move on to the next thing. Right. With our kind of people, I was working in public health, like, at the time, and I was just listening to, again, people just talk all kinds of shit. Like, you know, this whole complex that people have when working in the West about, like, oh, these Africans and their AIDS and their HIV, and, like, they're all dying, and, you know, like, give us money so that we can spend the money on ourselves to help them, kind of situation. Was like, that was basically the feeling. And I, you know, again, being from a country that at the time, Nigeria was percentage-wise very low percentage of population that had HIV, but or that was known to be positive. But at the same time, Nigeria's got a huge population. So that was actually the third largest population of people living with HIV in the world. So you have a very interesting disconnect in a society where most people, you could say, would actually not know somebody who has HIV. So this thing is still this, like, myth that is manufactured in another place. And yet at the same time, it's a very real thing because so many people are actually at risk, right, in a way. And, like, that disconnect was what I found rather interesting. And the way that disconnect, like, you know, makes people's lives complicated as opposed to this blanket, oh, they all have HIV or they're all at risk, like, therefore X, right? It's more that, like, people live in a complicated society and will make and sort of, like, define their, or, like, construct their personalities to deal with that complexity. And if you remove the complexity in the narrative, then you have no hope of understanding, like, exactly how people will approach dealing with this with this, epidemic, disease, or illness. And I think what's interesting is finding that out, people finding that out like in a hard way in Western societies with this coronavirus, where the overwhelming narrative is, oh, we just believe in science and everybody. And then all of a sudden you got people talking about, oh, I'm not going to take vaccines because vaccines are going to install microchips in your arms. Like, you only get there if you are not thinking of yourselves as complicated people. And, you're finding that happens here just as well in the United States. You guys in Canada are doing a lot better than we are. As it does when you apply that logic and that worldview to other people, right? And so, if you read a bunch of the research papers, like the anthropological studies that people were putting out there about Africans and why HIV/AIDS must be rampant in these societies, I mean, it's worth reading some of the stuff because it's insane. Like the way that like some of these white folks get out there and they just start telling stories that have no basis in reality. So it's like, I think I remember one line, which is like from a paper written by esteemed professors from a very esteemed college or university, that basically, the gist of it, right, is like, well, they might not be monkeys, but they're certainly fucking like monkeys, right? Like, and that's like I'm putting it in that language because I think it has to be said in that way, right? Like that is the story or their narrative that like people had about Africans when it came to HIV. Come to find out that when you actually go and look at the stats, like the number of partners that African folks have and the number of partners that people have in the West are actually, over the course, you average it out, probably the same. It's just the pattern like of relationships is different, right? But like, you have this idea that this is a supremely promiscuous society, or these are supremely promiscuous savage people on the continent of Africa, and that's why HIV/AIDS is spreading. Also, why is it spreading? There's a very simple thing. It's economics, right? In one place you have the money to like to make and procure the drugs to treat people, and you found that the simplest way to stop this disease is to just treat people. Right? It's not to try to get people to stop having sex, because people will have sex. That's what people do, right? Like, we all have that drive. It's to like make it so that it's harder for people to contract the virus. And it's also, if they do get it, that they're treated so that makes it more difficult for the virus to spread from person to person. It's very simple. And it took years of people spending all kinds of money on quote unquote behavior change stuff because they had a very simplistic understanding of who we are as Africans before people were like, oh, wait, we should probably just spend money on drugs, right? That's the essentially the essence behind our kind of people. And then Speak No Evil, I think for me came up because for a number of reasons. One, it's like this, I think I started writing, but like all the debates about Africa and African sexuality and the way that we are, right? The fact that you would have some people in Nigeria and other countries too, but I will pick on my own, where we've passed this bill that gives you 14 years in jail for expressing homosexual tendencies, as if our understanding of sexuality is so rigid and has always been rigid. That's number one. And then I just got really interested in the way that this plays out in families that have rigid belief systems, right? Or systems of belief that like don't allow for the complexity of people within the family, and then how that then comes up against this other added idea of like what happens when you're bringing belief systems from one place into another environment, and how does that play out? So you have a father in Speak No Evil who has a very rigid Christian understanding of himself and the way that people are supposed to be in the world and sexuality, and a son who is exploring or trying to understand a different way of being in the world, and how his identity is different. And it's both a question of sexuality, it's a question of like the immigrant mentality versus the first generation mentality. It's a question about racism, and like the best way to behave in a society, like all those things. But again, it's about complicating people's understandings of themselves and of us as a people. And that's really, I would say if there's a central project, that's what it is for me.
Okay, storyteller. Thank you for that. I love how you touched upon history, anthropology, dropped some scientific facts. It's fascinating to see what can get included but also excluded, of storytelling. And And maybe on that, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what role has the internet and social media platform sort of played in cutting out, if we want to call it like the middleman, and helping authors like getting directly to their audience? Because, you know, one thing you've touched upon is also like we've been talking also about like the power dynamics of whose stories are being told. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, this is one of the areas where I feel completely unqualified, because as one of my younger cousins said to me, she goes, "Uncle Uzo, you have the Instagram of a 30-year-old." I was like, well, there's a reason for that, you know. And this was like, you know, 8 years ago when I was 30. So yeah, I'm maybe not the best verse in it, but I will say a couple of things. One is, platform-wise, again, just remember that like not everybody has the same level of access to the internet that we would like, right? So is it important, and has it been important sort of democratizing? Yes, but at the same time, it's not necessarily as democratically efficient in terms of getting stories out there as we would like. That said, I think when you look at, you know, the exposure again, and the importance of being able to circumvent sort of like gatekeepers, it's really amazing, right? Like, think about who is it? It's that who's that? The kid in Italy? I think he's Senegalese in Italy. You know, the one who makes those funny faces. Yeah, that guy who's just hilarious, right? And like, think about, you know, this guy has like how many million followers, and he's just bringing, and what's so great about that is like, that's storytelling in a completely different form, but he's like bringing this lens on, you know, the absurdity of life in like Western countries, and in that sense, like promoting and propagating a worldview about, like, you know, how we think as Africans, or I should say, like, how they think as, you know, like, that's so like powerful and so meaningful. And it's not like he didn't sit down to write a treatise, but it's like such a remarkable, dynamic, and creative form of storytelling. You know, I could watch his feed for hours. It's just like, you know, how do you have that sense, right? And I think what's interesting is that's like also a profoundly, again, if you talk about dynamism, would someone have been able to storytell in that fashion even 5 years ago? Like, that's the medium and the messenger interacting in a really amazing and dynamically positive way. You know, there's so many. It's like the Kenyan comedian who became big during coronavirus, right? Because of her, like, people were at home watching her do her thing. Like, that's also, you know, so I think that, you know, these people that are like able to use these platforms and that are thinking, you know, again, and I would say that we don't give folks enough credit. People just see some Instagram kind of person or some YouTube or TikTok person like doing these things, and we're not thinking about just how complicated it is for these people to push that message out there. Like, I have nothing but props for a bunch of those folks, especially the ones who are like really creative in their approach to like tackling some of the absurdities of our existence as humans, and of course the relational absurdities between like how we live and who we are and our worldviews as Africans, and the ways that people think of themselves outside of our continent. You know, I think that that's just such an interesting and dynamic and important way of storytelling, and one that completely subverts the way that we think about how stories should be told.
Absolutely. And, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about kind of your process as an artist, your perspective on other artists and other forms of storytelling. But at the same time, you're also the CEO of the Africa Center down in New York City. So, you know, with all the work being done at the Africa Center, it seems, you know, let me not jump the gun, but it seems to align with Pan-African values of solidarity, unity, community building, and whatnot. So what are your thoughts on Pan-Africanism as an ideological framework and movement, and how does it shape your work?
Yeah, I think if you're a diaspora African, then like you will naturally gravitate towards Pan-Africanism, right? Because, you know, think about that thing. You grow up, and as much as there are like a gazillion Nigerians in the world, like in the United States, they're not just a gazillion Nigerians, and you interact with Africans of all different sorts, right? So it's, you know, here in New York, for example, yes, they're Nigerians, but they're also folks from Senegal, right? Like, they're also folks from Guinea. there are also folks from Congo. And like, you know, what you share is an understanding. It's both an understanding that comes out of sort of struggling to be recognized as fully human, which automatically gives you a language. But then, you know, like I would be loath to say that like our understanding of ourselves as Africans, or our connection through Pan-Africanism, is only about struggle. It's also about some of the very real kind of similarities in the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we construct our cultures, right? That's a really important dynamic. And like, I think it's a superpower in many senses. And I think it's a superpower that some of these, like the older thinkers, writers, you know, like leaders recognized, didn't always execute in the most robust or adaptive fashions, or might have recognized on a philosophical level, but when it came to a practical application, were kind of caught in some of the things that catch us all, which is like being enamored of difference that ultimately doesn't really mean anything, but that can be very powerful as a political tool, you know. And so I think it's that dynamic. I want to be recognized. Like I have a lot of pride in being a Nigerian. I have a lot of pride in being an Igbo man. I have a lot of pride in being from a particular village, you know, in Eastern Nigeria. Like that means a lot to me. But at the same time, like that is not, you know, ultimately in the project that I think we have of like recognizing full humanity of everyone, recognizing ourselves as full humans from the continent of Africa, I think those things do need to be subordinated to an ideology of humanness that I think is very well expressed in philosophies of Pan-Africanism. So, you know, I'm totally on board, and I think our center is very much on board. But, you know, the tension we have at the Africa Center is how do we make sure that even as we promote and think about ideas of Pan-Africanism, we're not flattening the surface, right? Because you, as someone from Cameroon, Maurice, like, you know, you've got a particular understanding, and like, you know, we can get into all the breakdowns of what it means to even be from this entity called Cameroon. And Fanta, I'm not sure where you're from. I'm guessing from
Guinea and
Guinea,
Senegal.
I was going to say. See, but even that, right? You're talking about Guinea and Senegal, right? Like, you know, so it's an interesting like dynamic there, right? Like, is that division even a real one, right? Like, and how do we think about that division? You know, so, but again, it is a very real one, right? Like, one of your parents is from this place, one of your parents is from the other, and that does define who you are, but the connection also defines who you are. And that's what we have to be very cognizant of, right, as folks who run a Pan-African, pan-diasporic institution. You know, and it gives me a headache a lot of times, but I think it's a good kind of headache. It's also a headache if you're Nigerian, because there's just so many of us, right? Like, you know, you could get away with thinking that like Nigeria is the center of the whole entire world. And I've learned that other Africans don't really like that.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned, you know, sometimes it's a headache. But I'd like to know, like, in terms of like project management, like really because, you know, you're a CEO, right? So a lot of what you're doing is really operational. And it's really, there's a practical dimension to, like, we've discussed like the values of, you know, Pan-Africanism, of solidarity that underpins the initiatives that you're working on. So maybe could you like discuss, or you can give us an example of a project you're working on, but really something that's able to highlight the challenges in sort of connecting the diaspora and some of the current, sure, you know, major challenges that you're interested in tackling through this center.
Yeah, I mean, I should say as like a CEO, like you're really only as good as your team. And so I would say that my major job is to pick the people who actually know what to do. And I would, for example, not be in any position to say anything if not for someone like Alana Francis de Govaya, who's the Chief Programs and Experience Officer at the Africa Center. She's one of the first people I hired. Interestingly enough, she is not necessarily a continental African. She's a diaspora African. She's from the Caribbean, but grew up in Southern Africa. You know, so it's that when we talk about Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist philosophies, like that's something that's really, really important to us. And it shows in who's on the team. You know, we've got folks from Ethiopia. We've got folks from the Caribbean. We've got, you know, like from all over, trying to bring people together in this understanding, you know, to create that again, the tension is positive. It can be positive and it can also be negative, but the importance is it needs to be there, and you need to harness the positive aspects of it to get the full kind of spectrum of who we are as Africans. That's one. Two is practically, I mean, it looks like, for example, one of the things that we're looking at doing is this well, I should talk about what we have done. We did this program on genetic diversity on the continent. You know, again, going back to how do you speak about a continent that people often just think of as blackness, right? When in actuality, there's more genetic diversity on the continent of Africa than there is, and we're talking about human genetic diversity, than there is in any other population. Why? Because we are the origin population. So you would see there are more branches at the root than there are as you get further, so like further away from the root, right? So, you know, if you look at European populations, they tend to be a little bit more genetically similar than even we are on the continent. And, you know, so how do you organize a program like that? How do you then bring together not just, and when we talk about diversity, it's not just diversity of region or country or whatever. It's also diversity of field and thought, because we've got Africans doing all kinds of amazing things. So you bring together a philosopher like, you know, Kwame Anthony Appiah with a historian like Mamadou Diouf, right? So we've got Ghana, we've got Senegal. Then you're adding Dr. Ambrose Wankam, who's like a geneticist. You know, you're bringing Cameroon into the picture, and then you're adding in, you know, like, you know, it's just like, and then you've got artists, right, from like who are African American, who are then, you know, bringing in that philosophy and that perspective. You know, like that's what we try to do, and that's how it works very practically. Like we would have loved to do that in person, but coronavirus. So, you know, also great though was to be able to have everybody for 2 days together on a Zoom. Sorry, I should add, you know, like we had like AI folks talking about like how the relationship of science to genetic typing, all that sort of stuff. Like, you know, from Southern Africa, Mutale, I think she's from either from Zimbabwe or Zambia, right? Like, so, but you know, again, it's like, how do you, the practical application of that is like bringing all these different people together, right, in conversation. You know, I'm not going to get into the sort of like the logistics of organizing that kind of talk, but on a practical level, it's when you see all these folks, you know, speaking their speak, bringing their different fields and their areas and levels of expertise. That's how you create a new understanding of who we are. And that's how you complicate the understanding of who we are as Africans. That was like one of the most enjoyable programs I think we've done. And, you know, it was 2 days over Zoom that people stayed for every second of, because, you know, it's just so fascinating, like to listen to a geneticist talk to a philosopher about identity and what that means. And to have two Africans doing that, that's what we are as the Africa Center.
And you know, one of the things that has brought us together in this Project UMOJA and what we're trying to do here is unity, right? We've spent, all of us, everyone on this team has spent a lot of time in university, being involved in student associations pertaining to our African identities, our Black identities, organizing our community. And you know, it's easy when you're young and you look at documentaries of Nkrumah and all of these like founding fathers and these women that made our independence possible. Like, it's easy to like mythicize it and think everything's perfect. But when you're actually driving to bring our community together, and by community, not just like the Nigerians or the Cameroonians or the South Africans, Zimbabweans, whatever it might be, all of us, you know, it's incredibly challenging. So what are your thoughts on you know, the United States of Africa, or these overwhelming structures that try and reconcile all of our diversity? You know, like, well, what are your thoughts on that and their role in this world we live in?
I think as thought experiments, they're extremely important. You know, I think the idea of utopia is always an extremely important thought experiment. But I think you can't get to the issues that when you try to build like a utopic society, right, that's when you end up killing a lot of people. And all we need to do is look north to Europe to see like their versions and their ideas, their movements towards like what utopia is, has often led to lots of bloodshed and violence. So I think as an idea and like as a project, it's important to think about what greater unity looks like. But I think you have to understand and allow for, because the issue is that when people think about greater unity, again, people often go to the most simplistic form, which is a flattening of identity, right? And it's like, how do you get people to be unified? It's like you just erase complexity. Because the truth is, I mean, you guys, I'm sure you have parents, you have brothers and sisters, you have like aunts and uncles. Can you even get your family to agree on when to leave the house? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just thinking back to like the last vacation we all went on as a family, and just the irritation. It's like, okay, you're trying to go here, and then your dad says, no, okay, no, I need to go make sure that I turned off the vacuum cleaner. And then your mom is like, okay, tells your brother, because we all know that African parents love to do this, go upstairs, and get my handbag, so then bring it downstairs when your brother is in the basement. So that takes 15 more minutes. And then, you know, your sister has like 3 kids. Do you know what I mean? And that's just one family, and everybody's trying to do their own thing. And so think about that now across 1.5 billion people in countries and cultures that share some common elements, but also are extremely different and are enamored of those things that make them uniquely, you know, like what it makes me quote unquote uniquely Igbo, what makes somebody quote unquote uniquely Yoruba. Again, these are not static. These things change and transform over time, but people are wedded to this idea of tradition. So, and that tradition is really beautiful. Like, how do you have a project of unity where pluralism is the key thing, as opposed to a flattening, like everybody must behave like me, therefore, like, so that we can get things to operate efficiently. That's what scares me about a sort of like this idea of a sort of like a completely unified, efficiently operating state, because I think there's so much beauty in being able to recognize, me being able to say and see you as somebody who's from, you know, like Guinea and Senegal, and say, oh, you know, like you guys do things differently from me. That's amazing. How do I respect that? Allow that to exist. Allow that to like influence the way that we operate as sort of like Africans, and then like hope for like a positive outcome of that, as opposed to, no, like we all have to behave the same way. And that's you know, I don't know what the answer to that is. I just know that like I don't think that that's a top-down process, to be honest with you. So I do think it's important to have like structures like the AU. It's important to have visions and things like the African Free Trade Agreement that bring us together, right? But those things are not going to solve like for like living in a pluralistic and a fully pluralistic society. That's a much more involved, much longer, and hopefully like it doesn't have to be seeing that we've seen other people do it, I think, the wrong way, where you just slaughter a whole bunch of people and then realize that that's not a great way of getting people to agree with you. Like, I hope that we don't have to do like as much of that as the rest of the world has done, because I don't think it's necessary.
And I really like how you touched upon like pluralism, and you know, you've answered this question, but really from like a value-driven perspective. And I think this is a really good segue into, you know, discussing African, you know, leadership. And, you know, I know you've mentioned right now, like the African Continental Free Trade Agreements. There are many different, you talked about like the AU in terms of, you know, institution building and what it can deliver. So you know, there's a lot of ongoing initiatives and infrastructures and institutions, you know, that really have a transformative potential, but a lot of it also comes down to leadership. Speaking of leadership, you know, let's talk about your mother, the one and only, who, you know, who has really inspired and continues to inspire many people. So she was recently featured as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Times Magazine. She's the first African and first ever woman to serve as Director General of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, a 164-member group that oversees trade across the world. And this is particularly interesting because we know that there are so many power dynamics within this organizations, and so I mean, we're filled with pride. So I can imagine, can't imagine what you and your family are feeling like. We've seen her, you know, walking these halls of power in her traditional African print. And really, once again, the question of leadership. How, like, can you speak to us about African leadership? What does it mean to you? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you incorporate leadership. You told us right now, beyond your role at the Africa Center, you're also a teacher. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's funny. We are very proud of my mom, and I'm super proud of my mom. I mean, I did not include her as one of my heroes, and she very clearly is. It's just, you know, you can't say everything all the time. I have learned a lot about leadership from my mother, but in so many different ways, you know, and it's you know, I can tell you some of the things that she said that, like, you know, folks are like, oh, so profound. But like, I think it's more just, it's like a sense of self, like a sense of person, you know, and just being able to spend a lot of, I mean, I've been super privileged, right, to be able to grow up with this person as like a guide and a sort of somebody who moves you through life and gives you all the love and wisdom that you could ever want. So, I mean, you know, in terms of things just like leadership, on like the relationship, for example, how you deal with the West as an African leader. I remember there was one day I found myself in London, and this was when my mom was Minister of Finance in Nigeria. She happened to be there for something, and I was there for something entirely randomly. And she was like, "Oh, you're here in London?" I was like, "Yes." She's like, "Okay, come with me." So I ended up going with her to this dinner, and we were in the car, riding down like Whitehall, you know, where all the British government buildings are, and you know, like those buildings are super imposing and all that sort of stuff. And I remember turning to her and saying, you know, this is what Nigeria needs. We need like this kind of like monumental architecture. And she was like reviewing papers. She didn't even look up, and she goes, "But we paid for all of this." You know, and it's like things like that that just, you know, it's that understanding of how you know what your power is, even if it doesn't look like you have power, that I think are so important. You know, that you know, it's those like kind of comments, that worldview that I think she has helped me to shape, that I think about what it means to be an effective leader. And so, you know, to distill, it's not just about grandioseness. It's not about like, how do I project outwardly? It's knowing where your core sense of power actually is, and then employing that, and like having a real sense of self when you put yourself, you know, out there on the world stage. And I think oftentimes, you know, my criticism of African leadership would be that we move to the grandiose very quickly, right? It's all about like pomp and circumstance, and that like core inner sense of just like of quiet power, of knowing when not to move, of knowing when to take a stand, of knowing how to take that stand, again, of being integrated, you know, like your sense of self, your inner self, and the outer projection being like very close. Like, I think that's what I've learned about leadership from my mother, right? And I think I see that in other people who we consider to be really powerful and important leaders. And, you know, it's everything in the way that, you know, she moves. I mean, for example, like I'll poke you a little bit on this idea of like her wearing traditional gear. This actually comes from that thing that we did on diversity across the continent, where somebody put up a picture of a wedding dress, and then they put up a picture of somebody rocking quote unquote traditional gear, and they asked, which one of these is traditional, right? And that's the framework that I think we need to break. And I think that's a statement that she makes, like every time she gets out and wears quote unquote traditional gear. She's just wearing what people would wear in Nigeria, right? And saying like, you want to rock a suit to this thing? Well, you know, it's power for me to get up and say, I'm going to rock my own thing, and they're on par with each other. And, you know, you don't think about it, but like that is also what leadership is about. It's not about necessarily getting up and pounding the table every time. It's about saying, I am going to be true to an understanding of who I am as an African woman, and I'm going to show you that, and I'm going to be brave and courageous enough to show you that. And then what happens, you know, which I really love, is like when you see other people say, you know, I didn't have the courage to do that until I saw your mom out there rocking, you know, our clothing. And now I do it because like it, you know, like it's power. Like it means a lot to me to be able to like inhabit myself as myself in a public space and not worry about what people are going to say. And that, in my mind, is what leadership is about, as much as it is like, you know, making statements to prime ministers and like shaking hands with all the world's most powerful people. That's what I take away. And that's like what I'm really sort of interested in cultivating in myself. And if I have the opportunity or privilege to try to cultivate that in other people, like that's kind of what that's the most powerful thing for me. You know, and then I just have a lot of love and respect for my mom. I mean, my mom was also like, there's who she is, you know, like that's, you know, it's weird to see your mom on the cover of Time magazine, and to also know that like the next day she's yelling at you because you haven't moved, like helped her move the rug that she needs you to bring.
Talk about influence, huh?
You know, exactly, right? So it's like, you know, because she's also that person who will like be like, you know, but really though, you need to help me hang this painting. And I'm like, but aren't you like some kind of world leader or something? Shouldn't there be somebody to do that for you? And like, no, like she's still your mom, and your mom still wants you to come home and hang the paintings, like that kind of thing. Which, you know, is ultimately like the best kind of relationship that you can have. I mean, I think it would really suck if you could only relate to your parent across the pages of Time magazine, right? Like that's not
Absolutely.
a relationship. And I feel very lucky to have a real one.
You know, I don't want to butcher this stat, but I believe it's something around like 60% of the African continent is under the age of 35, right? So we have a lot of youth, a lot of very, very young people. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what African governments should be doing, African governments and institutions should be doing to nurture this next generation of leaders. And it's strange because we kind of have like, a lot of people will be like, oh, like even me coming here, I came here in 2016 to the West for the first time, having grown up in Africa to do my undergrad. And I was like, I'm going to come here and, you know, I'm going to learn everything that has to be learned, and I'm going to go back and we're going to change Africa. And I think, you know, then I started to learn that like, hey, people have been coming here since like the 60s and the 80s, and that like, we're not the first generation. No one cares about you. I mean, you know, my experience is important, but in the larger scheme of things, it's you know, it's negligible. Right. You know, so we've had people come back and things are progressing. Let's give us some credit, you know, but oftentimes not as well as we wanted to. So how do you actually form leaders? You can't have everyone go out. You know, that's not really a model, you know. So what should African governments be doing?
I mean, it's not just that it's not a model because it's not a model, but it's also not a model because unfortunately for us, like we've bought into this idea that like these other systems and worldviews are somehow better, right? Like on a mass level. Like I think that's the biggest issue. Like, you know, you look at China, they sent people out, right? But they didn't send people out because it's like, oh, they have like the West has its shit together. Like we need to do that. They were like, y'all need to go out there and see what they're doing that works and like bring it back, and we'll try that. But we're also not going to shift our core understanding of the project that we have. And you can agree or disagree with how China sets itself up. Like, you know, there's a lot about China that like, you know, leaves to be stuff to be desired. But you can also admire the fact that these people, like as a nation or whatever, have a real sense of self and pride and importance in their role in the world. I think that's really, really powerful. So when you come from that position and you say, all right, go out there, figure out what you can get, bring it back, and let's start building these microprocessors, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, or let's start like building these cars, or let's start making these solar panels, all in the service of this project of empowering us as a people. Like, that's a really important thing. And I think the initial generations, and it's not just the 60s, man. Remember, people were going out before, right? Like, you know, like you're talking about 20s, like you're talking about people who even managed to get here and get back without being like churned by this American system of racism. Like, back. Do you know what I'm saying? So let's think about that like back and forth trafficking of ideas, like that's been going on for a very long time. And also remember that it's not just a one-way trafficking of ideas. That's so much of the reason why we're sitting in anything that's like, you know, comfortable here in the West is because Africans brought all kinds of knowledge to this place. Like, and that was employed, and knowledge, skills, expertise. These people wouldn't have been able to build this place. Like, have you seen what medieval Europe looked like? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, they would not have been able to build this. It's the power of the exchange of ideas. Like, that's what makes a place like really important. Unfortunately, like they benefited entirely from the exchange and we didn't, right? And that's a problem. And so now it's like, how do you correct that? So that it's like, it's all about exchanging ideas. It's all about going out and saying, okay, so maybe we don't have the capacity for somebody to study like, you know, nuclear particle physics on the continent because there's no, you know, collider there, but like we can send that African kid out and like have that person get the knowledge and come back. The issue is that like the conditions for coming back aren't great, number one. But then two, also we've completely, I think, forgotten on like a philosophical, and again it goes back to narrative level, like how do you construct a system like internally, right? How do we privilege our own understandings and systems of knowledge so that like we say that, you know, somebody who comes up in a local system is coming up with so much powerful and important and world shaping knowledge, right? It's not just that you go out to the West and the West has its own understanding. Like how many people in China actually left to go to the West? The majority of them didn't. Do you get what I'm saying? The majority of them said, we're here. We just gonna have to build this thing for ourselves here, right? Like, and it's a similar thing. Like, it's not that we're not doing that in Nigeria. It's not that we're not doing that in Cameroon or Guinea, Senegal, whatever. We are doing that. It also happens to be that like a lot of the people who sit on top of the structure have lost faith in themselves as Africans and have then lost faith and project that onto a younger generation, right? So, you know, you have the person who's out there collecting billions, I'm not going to name countries or names, like, and shipping it off to, you know, Switzerland. has forgotten about how creative, powerful, dynamic that young woman in, you know, I'll just pick a random country, Cameroon, is like, as that person is like building a business or thinking through like, some artistic project that will shape the way the nation and her fellow youth think about themselves. That's a really important thing, but that's an issue of faith, right? It's faith in yourself and faith in that younger population. And so what's the solution? In some ways, it's like, this older generation of people needs to step aside, because not even that we have lost faith in them, they have lost faith in themselves. I think that's the biggest issue, and so the issue, of course, then is like, people who sit on top don't just step aside. And unfortunately, a lot of the times the move to get there like ends up being like pretty bloody and like and violent. And that's like the scary thing that I think we have to think about is it's like, how do you wrest power from a set of people who have lost like faith in themselves, who have lost the initiative to make a place like meaningful and powerful, when you have a whole population of folks who can't wait to share their creativity with the world on their own terms. Do you know what I'm saying? Like people who are like, I would love, like, I haven't met somebody who like, how do I say this? It's a very small percentage of people who actually really just want to leave home and go somewhere else and live forever, right? Most people like would like to go and visit somewhere else, but ultimately like want to be in the place that they're from, want to be around like things that make them feel comfortable and familiar. That's just true across the world. It doesn't matter. And then there's some people who are explorers. Like the world's comprised of both sets of people, and both sets of people are necessary to construct the world that we live in. I would say that a lot of the folks who leave like end up leaving and not feeling super fulfilled, because they would most likely want to be back on the continent, like amongst like things that make them feel comfortable, building systems, societies, like opportunities that give others that sense of hope and comfort. And we're just not doing that. We're not doing it. And that's a problem, right? For a continent where the average age is 19, right? The median age, is 19, which means at 38, soon to be 39, I actually am an old person. Do you know what I mean? Like my cousin is like not entirely wrong when she teases me about having like an old Instagram. I'm like, one day you too will cross the age of 30, and then you'll see what happens. But like that's the thing. How do you empower youth? I mean, again, it's one of those things that has become so used that it's almost irritating to hear. I'm sure you guys, like, somebody says empowering African youth and you just roll your eyes, because you're like, well, what does that even mean? How does that take shape? I think the issue again is it's not so much as empowering as it is like shifting sort of like the flotsam of an older generation that has lost faith in itself to the side. And when I say that, I don't mean the entirety of that generation, because there's so many people there who have so many remarkable experiences and have so much faith in the youth and so much wisdom to share. But there's a set of people who's sitting on top of us who like have turned off their brains and also turned out or closed their hearts. And that's a problem. That's a really big problem. I don't know. The last thing I'll say to that is like, what often happens in situations like that is it's like by force or by choice, right? Like they can choose to let this next generation kind of like come up, or they will be forced out, and that's not going to be pretty. And I think that like, it's coming, right. And you see elements of it in different places. Like the whole End SARS protests in Nigeria, I think, are an example of people getting up and saying enough is enough. And at the same time, you then have the sort of like older establishment speaking back and saying, you guys should know your place. And that tension can only exist for so long before one side loses. Gives. And the issue is that there are more young people than there are sort of old elite people in power. And I think people need to remember that.
And I think just to quickly build on that, like one of the things that is one of our core values here is just cross-cultural communication, intergenerational dialogue, right? We're not here to like, obviously our target group is the youth, but we want to have that older generation because they have experiences, they have wisdom, and it is in our culture to have respect and reverence for our elders. But we're in this kind of like cross paths where it's kind of like we need to move forward as a community. Right.
I would say it's respect and reverence for elders who have respect and reverence for youth. And not all of them have that. So there's nothing more fun than being able to sit down with, you know, a quote unquote elder who's full of stories and wisdom, but you also understand in that relationship, they also really value what you bring to the table, right? That's a very different relationship from, you know, like somebody who demands respect and reverence, but doesn't actually think that you're a human. And again, I think that's the dynamic that we see is so many of these people are, you should respect me because I'm old. For what? What have you done? Right? Precisely. Like how are you treating people versus that older, wiser person who like gets up and says, you know what, let me listen, let me see, let me guide you, let me treat you as a human because I believe in you. I have faith in you, as opposed to I have faith in the material things that I'm able to snatch from the world.
Absolutely. Exactly. That's exactly it.
And I'd like to go back to earlier you mentioned, you know, one of those phrases that like that will make us, you know, roll our eyes often. And just to really build off on the question of leadership, like oftentimes we hear the when discussing, you know, big accomplishment, the notion of Black excellence is something that often comes up. I mean, you're a grad from Harvard, Columbia, doctor. I'm sure this is a concept that's you often hear about your own journey. What do you think of just generally that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one, and I mean, I think I don't know how do I say this. Like, yes, I believe in Black excellence. I think it's really important. I also think that we should be careful about how we define that excellence. I have all the degrees from all these institutions. A lot of that is, I care. I want to do well. I also have those degrees because I was put in a position of privilege by accident of birth, really. Do you know what I mean? Like, I could just as easily have been born, you know, like I have cousins who like were not born into my parents, like who then don't have the same access to these things. Are they not excellent because they don't have a Harvard or Columbia? Like, they're still excellent, they just haven't had the same opportunity, right? And I think we often confuse like sort of inborn excellence, or we think of like, you know, people's success, right, like as like evidence of excellence. You know, I don't necessarily think that that's true, right? I think that we have to be very careful about that because, you know, that's one. And then two, I mean, I don't know if you guys feel this way. Maybe y'all are just hot shit all the time. Like, you know, I often don't feel very excellent, right? Like, I think that's the thing is like you walk through life actually aware of just how much you're not hitting the marks that you want to hit. And I think if we keep putting up this like excellence, like we don't get at the very real struggle that we all feel every day. Like, you wake up on a cold day in Montreal, where, you know, some of you are, I don't know how y'all live in that city. And like, you know, you're trudging from your home to your work, and it's like the 10,000th day that you've done it. And like, you're not like, you feel like you should be, because you see all these magazines and you see all these things like shouting girl boss with the CEO, or like, ain't this guy, like, he's the dude, because like, you know, he's, I don't know, like Masai Ujiri is just like the man at the Toronto Raptors. And you're like, well, why the hell am I not Masai Ujiri? Or why am I not, you know, like Bozoma St. John, right? Like, these are excellent Black examples of Black excellence. Right. And I think it's, you know, again, it's like not telling the whole picture of what it means to be excellent. Like, is not that person who, like, you know, think about the average person who manages to get themselves on a plane, bring themselves and their family to Toronto or to Montreal or to New York City, and is like struggling every day to make sure that their kid gets into some public school that might not be considered excellent, but they make sure that that kid is like doing the thing, doing the work. Like, is that person not excellent? They might not have $1 million. They might not be sparkly and shiny, but that person is committed to excellence in a way that I think we have to acknowledge through and through. And I think about that a lot, right? It's like, you know, again, I've been super lucky. Like, I'm very fortunate. I'm really grateful for the fact that like my parents are as successful as they are, and that they were able to like push me in ways and like transfer like the stability and security of that success to me. But I also am not under the illusion that somehow makes me like excellent, right? It just makes me like lucky in many ways. And like, also I have parents that are like, you better use that luck for something good, right? Like, And I think a lot of us are more lucky than we are excellent, and then we confuse luck for excellence. And I just want to not do that as much as I possibly can.
Wow, that's incredible. I think that's exactly what we were trying to get out of you for that specific question, in terms of, like, you know, demystifying this idea of Black excellence and what these ungodly standards that we cannot hold ourselves to regularly. We're going to start winding down towards the end of our episode. So these are the final UMOJA questions. This is what we try and ask every single guest. The first one is, what do you think is the importance of African unity, or UMOJA? And by African, for us, we define it as all members of the global African community. So whether you're in the States, you're an African American, Southern African, from the Caribbean, Brazil, what do you think is the importance of African unity, and what can we do to unite Africans around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the unity is, the importance of it is it's about sort of a movement towards power, right? And I think it's important to be able to project our worldview out into the world, and thus, protect, I would say, our people. Like, that's the importance of African unity. It's about, right. if we are unified and strong, then you can't kill George Floyd in the street and just be about your business, right? Like, if we're unified and strong, hopefully we wouldn't have people getting on boats to cross the Mediterranean, but you can't just have people put people on islands and say that's where you're going to be, because we'll say, no, that doesn't work like that. So the idea of unity behind me, again, recognizing the diversity in that unity, it's about projection of strength, and it's about the sort of like strength and power in the service of protecting our humanness as Africans. That's what unity is about for me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. What are the top 2 issues that the African community around the world should focus on in order to build a prosperous and unified Pan-African global community? Of course, there are more than 2 issues, but some that are meaningful to you, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me in the work that I do, I think the 2 are this idea of narrative. How do we project our narratives? That's one. And I think it seems a bit like esoteric or whatever. We've talked about it, so I won't belabor it. But I think so many things stem from both the stories that you tell yourself about yourself, and also the stories you're able to project out into the world that help other people understand who you are. So it's about shaping narrative. That's one. I think the second thing that I don't think we're paying enough attention to nearly is this climate stuff. And, a lot of that is, again, about narrative. Like, how do we as Africans control that narrative, so that it's not just, oh, these poor Africans are going to die because of the climate crisis, and it's more that, y'all, first of all, you guys messed up. Let's just put the responsibility where it is. So don't be coming to me talking about, oh, all these Africans are going to be burning. No, that's not what it's about. So you guys messed up, own your shit, deal with the problem. And 2 is the continent itself is a place where, if we do it right, there's a huge amount of opportunity. And when I say opportunity, yes, there's the economics of it, but it's also about showing the world a different way of interacting with the environment around us, such that we don't have to destroy everything. Right. I soapbox for a second. I was able to attend this cooking demonstration by this Nigerian chef. And she was talking about, she had this video that was produced where they talked about palm plantations, and how one of the favorite things of people to talk about now is Europeans mouthing off about, oh, they're clear cutting forests in Africa, all of it, to plant these palm plantations. And what she was saying is what's really interesting is now palm has become the devil, and it's actual, in fact, palm and palm oil and whatnot. The way it was cultivated initially was really about a much more diverse ecosystem of agriculture, right? So that it was rotational. It was about diversity, in the planting, as opposed to these clear cut fields that was a European innovation or invention that came and just messed up the whole situation. So she's we have all these ideas about how you do it. Now what you find is in all these European countries, they're now talking about, oh, agriculture needs to be slow and diverse and all this stuff. And they were telling us that was insane and stupid and primitive and backwards from the beginning, right? And when in actuality, if we were really to believe our own stories right, and stay true to them, we know we have the knowledge for how you build ecosystems that support both human existence and also make sure the world, is a pleasant place to live. That's what we have to get back to, and that's what we have to own before these people now come in and tell us that they invented this system of rotational or diverse, agriculture that is going to save us. Like I'm if that happens, I'm gonna I'll lose my shit. I'll be honest with you.
We love that sustainability. We love that.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we want one piece of advice, a book, and a music to recommend to African youth listening to us.
Okay, so the book that I'll recommend, I actually just taught it last night. I would go with Wayatu Moore's She Would Be King. Wayatu is a Liberian American novelist. She Would Be King is a magical, powerful, amazing book. The music I would listen to, or the thing that I'm listening to right now, I don't know if you know the I think Canadian Sudanese Canadian Dua Saleh. I love, or I should say they are Canadian, Sudanese Canadian Dua Saleh. Look them up. Non-binary African immigrant musician. I just love the music. The song Warm Pants is I've been vibing to that for a very long time now. And I think they just released a new album. And then the piece of advice I would give is I would say make sure you go hard, but also take it easy, right? Which is something that I think I know people have been trying to tell me for a long time that I don't always take, which is life is not all about go, 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 don't forget to just relax, because that's how you actually get to the periods of creativity, and that's how you bring out the energy that you need to make the change that you want. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to that. I certainly don't, but I think it's something that I would really like to do a lot more of. So I don't know, take a walk or something.
Are you working on it? Are you working on it?
I'm trying, but we'll see what I get to this weekend. And when I say take it easy, it means take a walk. Or a couple weeks ago, I decided that I was going to try to refinish a chair in my apartment. I had this old chair that I wanted to so it's sanding it down, priming it, painting it. And, again, I have the opportunity to do that because things are secure for me, but it's that being able to step out of the stuff that is constantly swirling in your head for a second and just spend some hours literally sitting outside on your hands and knees, sanding. In some ways it just takes you into a different space, and you cool down a little bit is all I'm saying. And I think we all need to do that. It's not all about going to the club, but then again, I am in my late 30s, so there's that.
I might not be sanding a chair this weekend, but I'll go for a walk. All
right, go for a walk, yeah.
And the last question, it's in our section that we have. It's called Plug Talk. So can you tell us about a project that you're working on, or anything that you'd like our audience to know about you, something that they're working on, how to be in touch if they'd like to engage?
So I am currently, the thing I'm working on is a book of essays that really tackles this idea of political vulnerability, or so vulnerability as a concept in its relation to politics and our existence as Africans or Black people, diaspora people. That's what I'm working on, and that's both wonderfully invigorating and horribly frustrating at the same time, but that's my life. In terms of getting in touch with me, I think the best way is on Instagram. I'm at @UIWEALA, UIWEALA, and that's just that's where y'all can find me. I warn you, it is an old person's Instagram, so don't be looking for no pictures of me shirtless on the beach. That's not what it is.
It's okay as long as you follow back. As long as you follow back, then everything's good.
Right. Absolutely. Listen, UZODINMA, it's been an absolute pleasure. For our listeners at home, this is once again another incredible episode of the Project UMOJA podcast. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.